Good evening, classmates. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Tony Gonzalez, and this is my final video presentation based off of my final paper, which is a comparison and contrast of the 1976 and 2013 Big Thompson Canyon flood. The presentation is for PSSL 6252, Emergency Management and Crisis Communication. Before I get started into my presentation, I'd first like to explain why it is that I chose to pick this topic. First and foremost, the state of Colorado is not necessarily notoriously known for their natural disasters. So the first reason that I chose this is because outside of the occasional avalanche or the decades in between a single touchdown of a tornado in our state, we really don't incur a lot of natural disasters such as hurricanes, tornadoes, anything outside of weather that's pretty fundamental as far as emergency management and crisis communication goes. The second reason I chose this topic is because within this program and also kind of in my studies in the past, one of the main things I think of and focus on, at least in my profession as a paid professional firefighter, is we tend to think of terrorism as big events or massive fires or floods like Katrina. Those are the ones that gain most of the national media and attention, and I think sometimes, at least myself, I don't tend to focus enough on some of the more medium to mid-scale natural disasters that occur all throughout the United States and really truly challenge the states and municipalities where they occur. That's the second reason that I chose to discuss the Big Thompson Canyon floods. The third reason I chose to discuss them is because it greatly affected the area, not only where I live but where I work. We sent a tremendous amount of assets to the area to do search and rescue of people that were trapped in the 2013 floods. First and foremost, I'd like to explain furthermore how I'm going to present this to you is I'm going to present it into the four facets of what I believe are most important with emergency management and crisis communication. First of all, that's mitigation. This next one is preparedness. The third one is response. The fourth one being recovery. These are things that we absolutely have gone over in our class numerous occasions. It's something that everybody in this course is very familiar with, and I chose to frame the events of 76 and 2013 within these four parameters. So first and foremost, let's talk about the Big Thompson Canyon itself. It's 25 miles long, and it runs from Estes Park or Rocky Mountain National Park. It runs 25 miles down to the towns of Loveland and Fort Collins. Typically we don't see a lot of flooding there, but when the weather conditions are just perfect and ripe, we will see events like we have seen in 76 and 13, where a tremendous amount of rain fell and came sweeping down that Big Thompson Canyon and flooded not only the canyon itself, but flooded the outlets of Loveland and Fort Collins. So July 31st was the first event in 1976. Colorado had been experiencing a tremendous amount of wet weather in that summer, and on the 31st of July, 12 inches of rain fell in a matter of 4 hours. Typically, Colorado sees about 16 inches of rain annually, so we were about 4 inches of rain off of what we would see the entire year that fell in about 4 hours. In 1976, that flood came washing through ferociously, and it swept away 145 people and cost the taxpayers $35 million. Now again, that is 1976 dollars. That translates roughly to about $2 billion in today's world. Again, 145 people killed, 418 houses were destroyed, 138 businesses, and damage to 152 other structures. So that's the first event that had happened. The year following that, what we saw a few decades later, what we saw in 2013 was the same event. We had a storm system that came and literally parked itself over Estes Park. In between September 18th and 15th, we saw a rainfall of 18 inches again. Colorado typically gets about 16, so in a matter of 3 days we saw about a year's worth of rain in 2013. With that flood, what we saw was it killed just a matter of 8 people. Not that 8 lives are any less important, but it goes to show you the progress that not only the state has made, but also in many facets of mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. It goes to show, and it points directly to the facets of how we are working with emergency management now. This flood that recently occurred in 2013, it actually cost a whole bit more. It cost about $2 billion. But again, if you go back and forth and look at last in 76's dollars of 35 million and 2 billion, the costs were almost about the same. So first and foremost, let's talk about mitigation. So mitigation is defined as those activities that are taken before an accident happens. It differs from preparedness in that mitigation is things that can be done to infrastructure. It can be things that are done to the canyon walls. It can be where you actually plan to put your roads. It can be forestation and deforestation. It is preparing the municipality and the area around the municipality, so in the event of something that happens, we can meet it head on before it happens by addressing it through mitigation. So first and foremost, in 1976, there was not a whole lot of mitigation. In 76, Colorado was still somewhat of a frontier state where a lot of people visited or came to camp, but not a lot of people lived in Colorado. So mitigation for flooding pre-1976, there was not really a whole lot of anything that was done. You saw a ton of roads that were built right along major rivers, big bodies of water, and mitigation in 1976 did not include anything that was going on in Big Thompson Canyon. Furthermore, as far as mitigation was going, there was no plans in place for any of the forest fires that were taking away some of your things like trees and brush that prevents flooding from occurring like we see in Big Thompson Canyon. There was no thing as reforestation in 1976. Mitigation also went as far as there was no Office of Emergency Management, there was no emergency preparedness plan, and there was no interagency cooperation between the Tri-County area, which is Larimer, Boulder, and Denver counties. So we didn't see any of that as far as mitigation goes. The use of dams and the dependence on levees and the hope that precipitation did not collect was greatly relied on, whereas now you see waterways are being planned so that they let out in different places. In 76, we were damming water up and pushing levees. That was the big rage in 1976. Comparing that into 2013, what we see is learning from the lessons of the Big Thompson Canyon flood, the first flood. In 2013, a couple of things that we saw Colorado do is we absolutely addressed the erosion that was taking place in Colorado. So as a result, knowing that it takes very little precipitation to cause any flooding, the state has attempted to mitigate the problem in 2 ways, and that's reforestation and infrastructure. So what we're seeing is we are seeing a ton of destruction that is created in the spring and the summertime of burning away a lot of our forests and our scrub and our undergrowth, and that creates, again, like I said, flooding. Colorado has put forth an initiative since 1992 to really promote reforestation. So they have spent over $2 billion in trying to plant trees and native grasses in areas that are very susceptible to flooding. The other thing we see in infrastructure itself is you see a lot of retention ponds now in the area of Big Thompson Canyon. You see rerouting of waterways so that we're not having it collected in certain points, and you're seeing a whole lot less use of levees and dams where water can collect and overcome their structures and pour into the canyon walls. So that's one big change that we've seen. So before 1976, as I said, they were not necessarily focused on flooding, but after the 76 flood, a thorough assessment was accomplished to identify where the state should bolster infrastructure by placing retention walls to prevent mudslides, retention ponds to capture inordinate amounts of runoff, as well as updating and increasing water and wastewater systems. This addressed many of the flooding issues that we had. The other thing that was addressed was the state of Colorado worked closely with FEMA to ensure 100% of funding was paid back to businesses that decided to promote their business outside of the floodplain. So before a building was even built, an initiative was there to take place to make sure that we weren't building in a floodplain. And if they did build in a floodplain, FEMA would not reimburse them any of their money that they spent to get them out of trouble. Prevention is the next thing. Prevention does not seem to be something that's pragmatic when we're talking about flooding, but there's been a ton of initiatives that Colorado has undertaken with aspect of prevention. There's been a large public education initiative that was not in place in 1976. In 1976, there was no reverse 911. There wasn't even 911 in the state of Colorado in 1976. Reverse 911 was created and used for the 2013 flood. There's a website now that was created for up-to-the-minute information on flooding and precipitation. And the Tri-County area teamed up with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, weather radio for a county-by-county coverage. So radios get taken over during floods now. National Weather Service Flood Ready website is available to them, which wasn't available in 1976. Established guidelines to become storm-ready community. Provided emergency managers with clear-cut guidelines on how to improve their hazards and weather operations. The Larimer County Offices of Emergency Management, Boulder County Offices of Emergency Management were created, and the Tri-County area now works very closely with FEMA and USAR as well. When that flooding occurred, they had assets coming to them immediately. The response was different in the fact that the National Guard was used predominantly in 1976 to combat these floods. Fast forward to 2013, you saw in assets of municipalities that were actually going to the site to conduct search and rescue operations immediately, whereas it took sometimes up to 48 hours in 76 with the National Guard to go and look for people. It took a matter of minutes to get some of the first assets into those counties to find people. There's now more than 500,000 people living in the area, and now you have a ton of assets that are surrounding them as far as fire stations, ambulance assets, and police assets as well. There are, like I said, emergency operation centers in every single one of those counties that work closely with FEMA, the National Weather Service, and each agency is adept at collecting, disseminating, and making available information to each other. So everybody's communicating now where it's not just sole entities. So the Tri-County counties most certainly make decisions based off of intelligence that they glean from a robust network of trained entities, and they are forecasting now instead of reacting. Some of the recovery initiatives that were in place in '76 was just happenstances when something would get accomplished, and on our way to recovery, then we would call it recovered. Moving into the 2013 day and age, what we see now is less money being spent, less assets being used as far as recovery goes, and things taking place a lot quicker in Colorado as far as radio, telephone, and or mail service. People were also captured in Estes Park within a total of 72 hours, where it took in 1976 almost 2 weeks to get to some of these people. And they found that a few of the people actually died waiting for people to get aid to them, whereas in 2013 our response was a whole lot quicker. We can address that in many ways as far as just the evolution of emergency services, living in a world after 9/11, and absolutely using our communication to the benefit of those that are affected by an emergency. So in closing, while it took over 40 years to retest their capabilities, the Tri-County area learned from their mistakes and misfortune and evolved into a modern emergency prepared entity. While the dollar loss was significantly greater, the best statistic that comes out of the two incidents is a major decrease in loss of life, again from 148 down to 8. The creation of emergency management and crisis communication is where they keep this scorecard.